Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rethinking Porn Addiction. I like doing the introductions for new people. We have many new people every week who tune in. So my name is Nate. I'm up here on the top row if you're watching on video with Hans and Jake. We are the regular Joes who are talking about our experience with pornography. And down below us on the screen, we've got Kristen B. Hodson and Doug Braun Harvey. Both are clinicians. And especially for today's conversation, it's important to note that Doug has over 30 years of experience working in the space of sexual health and specifically helping men confront, and maybe you should summarize this better, but I'm going to do my best and you can clean it up, I guess. But helping men who are experiencing sexual impulses, urges, feelings, behaviors that are out of control and helping them kind of rein that in and feel like they're more in touch with in a healthy space. Is that a fair way of summarizing that, Doug?
Right. I think the word I would add is they feel out of control.
Yeah.
Which is, this is a person's own experience of themselves is feeling out of control rather than a kind of, measurable kind of standard of, once you cross that line, you are now out of control, and under that line, you are in control. That is not the concept here.
Got it. So that's a perfect segue into the conversation that we're planning on having today. And I'll just give I feel what is a deeply personal experience, but sharing it is probably the most universal experience to anybody who's watching. And I kind of typed it up in the description of today's video, but I think, at some point in my life, multiple times, I've had the experience of saying, I am done with pornography. I'm done. Not going to look at pornography ever again. It doesn't align with my values. I don't feel good after I watch it. It disappoints the people that I love. I don't want to, I want to be done. I commit to God. I commit to my partner. I commit to myself. I'm just not going back. And then whether it was a few days or a few weeks or a few months later, I would find myself sitting in front of a computer screen, typing in words in an incognito browser that I was ashamed of, and then sitting there and watching sexually explicit images, sexual imagery, and masturbating, and then going, how the heck did I get here again? Like, why can't I control myself? Why can't I stop looking? Why does pornography and masturbation have control over me as a human being? Like, why can't I break this habit? If it's so harmful and it doesn't align with my values and it's like not something I want in my life, why can't I just stop? And the name of this show is Rethinking Porn Addiction. And the language that I had growing up was, I'm addicted. And I think that's the most familiar and most logical explanation that a lot of people have when they have that experience of, I don't feel like I have control here.
Did the two words mean the same thing to you?
Oh, I lost you there. Did I lose everybody?
Is there a problem?
Nate might be the only one that's freezing up a bit. Nate, I think all the rest of us seem to be stable still.
Okay. I'm not having the problem. Oh, yeah. Nate was frozen. Yeah.
While he's trying to come back and get in, what Nate said gets to the quick, I think, of what I was anticipating and looking forward to in this conversation. And I can feel a little bit of tension or conflict building inside myself, hearing him intro it. I had very similar experiences at times in life. And I'm part of this show now, rethinking porn addiction. And I still would posit that same question of the feelings that I had and the experiences I had felt compulsive and out of control. Mm-hmm. And if it's not addiction, then what kind of framework can I put around that to better understand what it was that I was experiencing? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Doug, sitting in this room with you, it's an honor really to be able to hear what your years of wisdom have helped you to, or hearing what your years of wisdom have allowed you to help other people like myself navigate this space and that journey and that internal conflict and turmoil.
Jake, do you have some thoughts about this before we, because I'm really interested in each of the narratives of how you relate to this idea.
Yeah, I think it's exceptionally relatable. I think we are all, it's really interesting to watch the body language of Hans and I as Nate was telling his story, because we both sort of smiled at the same things and and I think it's so ubiquitous, and so as we were kind of talking about, this is what we want to talk about today, I know I got excited too, because I think it's every time I walk away, my notebook's filled with things that I've learned that I didn't know were out there. And so that's kind of how I'm feeling about going down this path today.
Well, I just want to make an observation first about the way Nate described in such, poignant detail his own experience, and then Hans and Jake, you both kind of really resonated with it. But the thing I heard that I hear all the time, always, when men talk about this, is they talk about the problem from one side and not both sides. In other words, they talk about the way it's doing harm, the way in which they feel ashamed of this. I have my notes here from Nate. It doesn't feel good. It's not with my values. It's a conflict with God and my partner and myself. It's harmful. So we've got, from those of you who've watched the show understand this idea, but that's the safety dimension of sexual health. All the interpersonal damage, the values dilemmas, the lack of, being congruent with oneself. I mean, these are all problems. They're all problems. And then this sense of, sort of making a plan. All right, here's what I'm going to do. As if making the plan is what all a plan needs to be successful. But that's kind of what people think. But that's only half the equation. None of you told me what was pleasurable. The closest we got was Nate said he masturbated. I don't know. Masturbation isn't always great and pleasurable. Sometimes it's not good. But yeah, so it's sort of what I was so intrigued by, and which is so common, is the inability to talk about what's the pleasurable part that is actually the conflict. That's the competing motivation. The reason Nate went back wasn't because he was dying to hurt himself again, or I want to go to that shame. I miss it. That was not the motivation. But it's so hard to talk about when somebody feels out of control with their sexual behavior, to talk about the pleasure. It is so, so difficult.
Why is that?
I don't know. Were you there? Am I telling you? Where does it take you? I mean, I'm just giving you my ideas here, but what do you think about that, Jake?
I mean, if I'm shooting from the hip here, and
that's part of our show, isn't it?
Yeah. For me, it's because how deeply rooted shame was intertwined with pleasure. And if I distill it down, all of the many things that I could write that potentially could be the reasons why, it's basically is that the pleasure aspect of it and the shame aspect of it, for me, almost melded into the same thing.
Right. So the feeling out of control can be partly felt because I'm going to something that does have some pleasure, but the shame is so merged with it, it's even hard to think about the pleasure as a separate, distinct experience that's part of it, because the shame is so merged. So if Nate were here, and I'm not going to ask Nate to tell me this on the show, but if I were talking to somebody in a more private room, which this is not, so I don't want to have these conversations. But if I were talking to somebody in a more private room and Nate said something about, I put words in the browser that I was ashamed of, I'd spend a lot of time on those words, and I'd spend a lot of time on the shame. So if somebody's typing words in the browser and there's a certain word that in your gut creates disgust, or in your gut creates a kind of shrinking shame, of kind of that withering kind of, your body kind of wants to go like that. Write that word down and then spend a lot of time figuring out how you came to feel shame about that word, because there's a long story there. There's a very long story there, and it's many sources. So actually the keywords you put in to find that image is a really important narrative for finding out why you feel out of control. There's a reason you type those words in. That's an insight into you.
Yeah. That's incredibly insightful, Doug. The idea of the pleasure being, for me anyway, I'm kind of making this connection for the first time. The pleasure is a component of the conflict. And I think about my upbringing and my personal education and my personal familiarity or encounter with the topic of sex or sexuality or sexual pleasure. And it was frankly, it was absent pleasure like that for the first 30 years of my life until I got married. Pleasure was not part of sex ed conversation or education, or it didn't exist for me in those conversations. And the idea of having had that much earlier in life and perhaps approaching the idea of sexuality as sex is great and you're really going to enjoy it for your entire life, as you figure out what feels good to you and what you like and what you don't like. It's amazing. And being able to have those conversations and approach it with that in mind, I think would have changed a lot of it. And you're right, 100%. There's a big story about the shame that's attached to that and the defensive.
Okay, now, Hans, I want you to practice.
Yeah.
Shame attached to what? You said that.
Yeah. Shame attached to participating, or shame attached to having sexual pleasure.
Great. Thank you. It's so important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The shame attached to having sexual pleasure is deep. And we've acknowledged it on the show here. A lot of that for me is my conservative religious upbringing and the family of origin that I came from and the culture that I personally was raised in. Mm-hmm. And simultaneous to my own personal journey and my own personal development when it comes to sexual health is my own very personal and very sincere consideration of what I believe when it comes to my own personal belief system and faith and religion and all of that. And so that's been, I think it's, for me anyway, it's important to acknowledge the fact that we potentially are talking about two conflicts here, one that has to do with shame around sexuality and one that has to do with shame around the religious culture, religiosity that is part of many people's storyline also.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge Nate for all the grace he's having with his technical problems today. and we are continuing our conversation. And so I applaud our whole room for we're just going to continue this conversation. So I'm really happy for all of us. Thank you, Nate. You did that very graciously.
That was a nightmare. I felt like I missed out on the most important part of the conversation. I apologize.
I just want to make a comment, Hans, to what you said about your sources of conflict, because again, what this idea is, if it's out of control, if we feel out of control, how is it this idea of addiction isn't really a great concept to really, and even in sexual science, when we look at sexual behavior becoming an addictive process in the way that somebody's relationship with drugs and alcohol, even gambling, and other things. And the research has found with porn, in particular, porn addiction, when they look at people who identify as porn addicts, there's measures out there. Are you a porn addict? All that kind of stuff. So people identify as porn addicts, and then they look at, okay, what do the people have in common? What's the most common element people have who identify with this idea of porn addiction? And believe it or not, the thing they don't most have in common is out of control behavior. That actually, there are many people who identify with porn addiction who their actual frequency, use, consequences, all the things we associate with addiction are very low frequency. They're just not. That's not a big deal. So it's like you think, they identify as a porn addict, but they're not like having ravaging consequences from their use of sexual imagery. So scientists got very interested in this because this is like, what's going on here? This doesn't fit the porn addiction story that's out there. And yet these people are definitely saying they're porn addicts. This is the most research out there. There's some other research coming, and I can't talk about it because it's not published yet. But this research that's out there that we know about says the most frequent common ingredient these men have who say they have a porn addiction, and it's not high frequency, it's they have a conflict with their religion. That's the number one source of that's what they have most in common. I mean, there's lots of differences, of course, and lots of things that make them out. But what they were most interested in, these factors of high frequency use and and all this stuff that goes with this porn addiction story. People who had religious conflicts, their behavior didn't look like that, but they felt the same way as the men who were completely, dysregulated. So it's the addiction idea, I think, is a way of trying to convey what I feel inside, not necessarily what I look like outside.
That's really enlightening for me. I think about my personal behaviors when I was using porn most frequently and when I felt like it was out of control. And I am fortunate that I didn't go through the kind of ravishing or devastating consequences that you've talked about that people can end up dealing with. I didn't lose a job. It didn't cost me any long-term relationships. I mean, my consequences, I say consequences now, my perceived consequences.
Good. That's a really important word. Yeah. Good. Mm-hmm.
My perceived consequences were primarily conflict in either a relationship with a family member or a friend and conflict with my own personal values around religion and worthiness. I'm going to offer as a word there.
Very important word in your religion.
Yeah.
Is worthiness. Very important word. Right. So that was a huge conflict, to be in conflict with your worthiness. Yeah.
Right. And the idea that my actual behavior was not indicative of somebody who truly is addicted to substance or some other medium is, in hindsight now, is really interesting to consider and look back on.
So now you said another thing. I want to add some research here because I think research helps us with these discussions.
Yeah.
When most of the ideas around porn addiction have been when they look at the brain when people are looking at sexual imagery and the different things brain do. And they found that in a lot of these studies, when people were looking at sexual imagery in a laboratory, their brain, under certain circumstances, looked very similar to the way the brains of people who were addicted to drugs and alcohol, that the kind of the reward circuitry of the brain, if we want to call it that, and people do, was distorted and kind of, not wonky in a way that was very similar to being how brains look when people are addicted to drugs and alcohol. And so they saw this as a lot of evidence for supporting the idea of porn addiction.
Yeah.
But then this sex researcher, who's a sex neuropsychologist, now there's an interesting job. She did a really interesting thing. She realized that, this is Dr. Nikki Prausa, she realized all of the studies of when men are looking at sexual imagery are done while they're not masturbating. In other words, nobody in these laboratories looking at sexual images on the screen were stimulating their body to feel sexual arousal, excitement, and orgasm. It just wasn't happening.
Yeah.
Now we all know, because we've all been there, our brains operate a little differently when our genitals are stimulated than when they're not. That's kind of the point. And so Nikki came up with this idea. Why don't we see what happens in people's brains when they're looking at sexual imagery and masturbating? Now, why was this important? Because almost all people, there's always a little outliers. I don't want to be 100% here. Most people look at sexual imagery while they're masturbating. It's not like looking at the family photo album from last year's vacation. There's a reason for looking at these photos or these images, and it's for sexual arousal, for solo sex or partnered sex. People look at imagery together. So she looked in her laboratory at people's brains who were looking at imagery and masturbating. Now, she no longer could be a scientist at a particular university because the university found out that she had people in her laboratories masturbating. So she had to go create her own sex science laboratory because a university was not keen on having masturbators in their laboratories.
Dorms only.
Yeah, I guess dorms only. Right. Dorms only, not in the laboratories, only in the dormitories, right? I love you. Thank you, Nate.
If that's my only contribution to this conversation, I'm okay with it.
It's a great one.
So what Dr. Prause found was how the brain looks and how our body functions when we're sexually stimulated and under the experience of sexual arousal is not the same as the way the brain looks when we're sitting there looking at sexual imagery. And the whole process that was defined as kind of a porn addiction process in the brain wasn't held up in her studies. The brain didn't look like those brains. It looked different. Now, I'm not a neurobiologist and psychologist. I talked to Dr. Prause and have her teach me how to say what I just told you. Notice how I got to say all of that without having to be a neuropsychologist. But her studies are remarkably important because they remind us that our body functions differently. And I'm glad it does when we're sexually excited. And that may be part of the reason people are in conflict and call it a porn addiction. Yeah. Because how their body feels when they're doing this thing they feel in conflict about is worth going back to, even though they're in conflict.
It's worth going back to, does it have, I just want to connect the dots on when you were saying it's not the same as a substance.
The brain does not function the same way. In the way the brain functions when a substance is induced into the brain, where these theories came from. The brain looks more like the brains when people are under the experience of sexual arousal and excitation, which does not fit with the theories of a brain under the influence of an addictive process. It's just not there.
So what does the brain look like when it's just looking at sexual imagery and not masturbating?
Well, that's where the idea of porn addiction comes from, because they're seeing that the brain functions in some of these ways that are more similar, and and again, but even those studies have been critiqued because there's a little leap they all make around addiction theory that they've not really been able to make when people are looking at sexual imagery. So we're getting into weeds here, but I don't know if it's useful, but I think it's just important to know people are studying this, and what I just described, these discussions I just described are sources of enormous conflict amongst people who study this. I mean, the conflict is really, really big around, can the brain look like has an addictive process by using sexual imagery or not? And it's not like the jury's in or out on this, but I think the most important issue is we need to understand how the brain looks when we're looking at sexual imagery while we're masturbating or having sexual activity, because that's by far the most common use that human beings have of that.
Yeah.
I feel like this is typically where I chime in and create a bridge, but I am lost. So,
well, ask a question. What do you like? Where are you in the woods that you need to get? want to know something.
Maybe I can just get one quick clarifying statement, because I don't know what we all have covered, but thank you for being patient, by the way, while I tried to sort out my internet connection. So here's the question I have then, Doug. You mentioned a couple of things that I thought were interesting. One is that oftentimes people who identify as an addict, their behavior doesn't align with the type of behaviors that an addicted person would have. So like the analogy that popped in my head is like somebody might somebody might consider themselves an alcoholic when all they're doing is going out to get a couple of drinks once a week with happy hour with their friends. Mm-hmm. And that's not the behavior of an alcoholic. But somebody
right. But I don't know if you were here, Nate, when we talked about that the number one reason men identify with the porn addiction idea that's in common, who don't have all these behavioral patterns that we think of when out of control behavior, is they have a conflict with their religion.
Right. So that's the second part of the juxtaposition here. So if you're a religious man and you feel like your behavior is out of control, and maybe you're looking at porn a couple times a week or a couple times a month, maybe even once a day, and it's way outside your values structure, but it's not putting, like, you're not at risk of losing your job. You're not hurting anybody. Hurting would be a quote unquote, because if you're doing it in secret, you could be like breaking a contract within the relationship. But so did you guys like create a label for that? Like what we call that?
We call that a conflict.
Okay. So you're experiencing a conflict.
You're experiencing a conflict, and you've been avoiding this conflict for a long time.
And what is it specifically that causes people to go back to something? I think you talked about this briefly, but if you could just recap in like 20 seconds, if you have such a moral conflict around it, why would you keep going back to it?
Because there's
the way you resolve a moral conflict is you have to talk deeply, vulnerably, and often with a lot of different people to work it out. So most of the people who say they go right back to it, they're in the pain place you were in, Nate. They're all alone. They've talked to no one. They've made a vow only with themselves, by themselves. This kind of what I call the unilateral treatment plan, that doesn't rely on anybody. Mm-hmm. And then they get disappointed it doesn't work. Which is, when men tell me that, I say, wait. That plan worked exactly the way plans like that work. There is nothing wrong there. The laws of physics are in good stead here, because if you have a major life problem and you talk to no one about it, and it has all of these terrible, shameful, psychological, relational, tense issues that keep you distant from every single person you love, I'm glad your plan failed. Because I wouldn't want the world to work very effectively if that's the way we functioned.
Mm.
I'd much rather have the world function where we have to do things like have vulnerable conversations, be honest, really grapple with big values questions. Life is not easy. And look at the culture we're raised in around sexuality. And so these are very complicated and difficult questions. And so when men resort to these, off the cuff solutions one night because they're hurting, and then 3 days later completely upset that it didn't work, good. I'm glad it didn't work.
I'm glad that you recapped, because we all got to hear what you just said, and that was really awesome.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. Very cool. So
when somebody says they feel out of control, that's something I can agree with. Yes, it does sound like you feel out. And the important thing in that question is the person telling me it is the person feeling out of control. I'm not saying to you, you're out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
why is that
distinction important? Control in that context, at least, means stopping.
Say that. I'm sorry, Jake, I missed something about your sentence.
For me, being out of control, the control that I was actually out of was stopping. I couldn't stop, hence I was out of control. And
okay, so there's the thinking error. I have no idea why you weren't able to stop. How you were trying to stop was not a good plan. But if your only goal was stopping without exploring why you want to stop, then stopping is not a great outcome to focus on.
But
If
that's
the only goal is to stop, not rather than understand.
I couldn't agree more fully with you, but I think that's what the sort of why we label it addiction for me was that there's this pattern that I've got no place to explore, where it's deeply rooted in shame, and then for me to be able to, like, the only outcome that I am made aware of or that I'm pointed in is to stop.
Oh, okay. Oh, now I understand.
Yes.
Because the addiction story is the story, and
Right.
the addiction story is to stop.
And because I can't stop,
I am therefore
I
different.
can't control, I am now out of control. Why am I out of control? I have no idea why. I just can't stop. Hence, I am an addict. Right.
Yeah. Well, when you only are given one story, it's hard to come up with another one.
Yes.
So Doug, will you say?
Hence, I'm sitting here in this room. Because that was the problem I saw, Jake. I mean, I saw men 30, 25 years ago coming to me for various reasons. I won't get into that, but I'd be sitting them and they would use this language. And it just didn't ring accurate for what they were saying to me and what I knew about sexuality. We have to remember now that we got to remember the origins of the idea of porn addiction did not come from people who are sexologically trained and are major sex researchers and knowledgeable people. The idea of porn addiction came from another field of study, which is substance use, drug dependency, addictive behavior. That's where that idea came from. And so,
where was it funded from?
Where you the knowledge base you rely on for trying to understand things will inform the way you come up with ideas of how it works. And so out of the addiction field came the idea of porn addiction. It did not come from the field of sex therapists, sex researchers, people who have spent a lifetime looking at and trying to understand human sexual behavior.
Doug, a metaphor that came up of what you're saying is if you meet with a surgeon, they're going to look at what the presenting problem is with the lens of a surgeon's expertise, and it's going to be surgical intervention versus going over to a physical therapist. That's the same issue, but the lens and the interventions would be different, but the problem can still be the same. And so that may be something when people are wrestling with these different things of the issue can be the same, but the lenses in which they were explored, understood, named, described by would produce different results.
So I love your description of a maybe physical therapist and a physician. The other key issue here is if somebody says they're a porn addict, are they telling me they have a disorder, a psychological disorder, an addictive disorder, like a kind of real condition, disease or a syndrome of behaviors? Is that how they see it? Or do they think they have a problem? That's not necessarily a disease or a disorder, but yet this is a real problem. I mean, problems are real. A problem's nothing. It doesn't minimize the concern. But when we call something a disease or a disorder, we have to know what we're talking about and be really clear. If we would have been having this conversation in the early 70s, I would have had a mental disorder. I would have walked into any mental health office and they would have diagnosed me as mentally ill because I'm not heterosexual. That's it. Yeah. Done. Case closed. So we have to be very careful about what we determine as a disease or a disorder. And I got to tell you this, when it comes to sex and mental health, they've done it really poorly. Mm. We can go through the last 100 years where the mental health field has had to take back everything they said about sex because everything they said about sex was wrong and it hurt people. Yep. So we have to be. So I'm really interested in let's call it a problem rather than a disease, porn use, because I think we need to protect people from people like me who think they know exactly what they're talking about and don't be honest about the fact that we actually don't know very much. And porn addiction presents itself as a very certain and clear idea of exactly what's going on.
Doug, I want to name something that you just said a couple times that for me is really important as part of this show. And that is we're rethinking porn addiction. And oftentimes I have felt like that has in ways kind of minimized or de-escalated or de-emphasized what's going on here. What you just said of it is a problem. It's not an addiction, but it is and can be a very real problem. It's important to me, I think, that I just emphasize that even though we're not calling it an addiction in this show and we're looking at other ways to address what's going on there, it is and can be a very real problem that is absolutely worth looking at and struggling through.
And it also doesn't make you pro-porn.
Right. So you see, there's this interesting, you see the privileging that happens with calling something a disease.
Yeah.
Right. It creates a space of where things aren't going to be doubted or questioned or, okay, that was, and so when it's called a problem, it does lend itself to these kind of biases that it's minimized, it's de-emphasized, it's not as serious or significant. And so, but here's the analogy I like to talk about. We don't call affairs a disease, but believe me, most couples therapists are sitting in their office with the lion's share of people who have not kept their sexual agreements, and that's why they're sitting in this office. Now, are all those people have a psychological disorder because they haven't kept an agreement in their relationship? That's a real problem. Believe me, these are real problems. But we don't have to call it a disease to have it be credibly respected and thoughtfully approached without harming people.
Credible respect. I love that phrase. Sorry, I'm dominating. Nate and Jake, you both want to say things. I've jumped in, but the credible respect of giving this problem the respect that it's due and that we should and can give it to help people work through it resonates with me really deeply.
Yeah.
And to me, the focusing on the conflict and the problem aspect of it, and it's the problem that creates a ripple effect of other problems. And in no way, shape, or form are we questioning the severity of those problems, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But it's, to me, the two things about the addiction model, or whatever the focus on addiction is, it then puts you like, yes, you do sort of take this label as someone who's got a disease, right? But then you also have an immediate treatment plan ready for you. And that is just nice and easy. And when you're in pain or you're struggling or all these other things, the easy way sometimes looks good. The other thing, when you
here's been my experience with people in the addiction approach to working with out of control sexual behavior. It's not easy. I really want to respect people who walk through these processes. It's not easy. I want to translate easy. It is something offered to you that is it's kind of organized and offered in a way that makes it readily accessible. But once accessible. So once you begin that accessible process, believe me, it's not easy.
No,
the difficulty, the anguish, the hard work, or whatever, it is as similar in that way. Yes. But it's certainly more accessible than alternative ways of approaching this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I never meant that in like sort of colloquial way, not and
that's why I wanted to.
Right, I misspoke.
I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a misunderstanding of easy. And does that fit for you? Is that what you were trying to say?
Absolutely.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
But then when you shift to focusing on it as a problem, one of the things that I like about that is most problems inherently have a solution, right? And there's a little bit more sort of hope involved, especially when you're like, well, once I figure it out. And the other thing about problems is you do have to work at them and tease them and sort of, figure out this problem. And I love that part, that it's, you then have more ability, I think, to go where you need to go. Once you get freed of this, addiction paradox of this is a successful treatment plan, it puts me in this disease category, it labels me, it defines me, and it sends me on my way. Then you go over here and it's like, I've got this thing, got to figure it out. I'm going to need, how do I figure out all my other problems? I talk to my spouse or partner, I do this, I read about it. And so to me, there's when we rethink it, and that paradigm shift happens, I think it can be incredibly hopeful and empowering as well.
I want to give you the ways from the way I work and the model I've developed. There's seven things to think about for rethinking when you think you have a porn addiction. Well, it's 7 areas of your life to look at that could all, in any combination, be really important things to think about that might be contributing to why you feel out of control looking at sexual imagery. One, believe it or not, is you might be living in a situation where you are physically unsafe. You live in an environment of violence. You might have suicidal ideas, and you might be actually thinking of doing violence to your own bodies. That you are literally not physically safe, either in your home or in your environment. These kind of stressors can be associated and cause at risk, for resorting to looking at sexual imagery. And then physically unsafe. And then there's actually medical problems. Like you can actually have a disease or a disorder that causes one's sexual behavior to become accelerated and out of control. An example is people can be treated for Parkinson's, and the medications for Parkinson's create what we call medically induced hypersexuality. The medications actually create this kind of hypersexual behavior. And so they might be looking at sexual imagery all the time. So there are real medical things that can cause people to be out of control in their sexual behavior. And then there's psychological mental health issues. People can have obsessive compulsive disorder. People can have bipolar disorder. People can have depression. People have adult attention deficit disorder. People can have anxiety and panic disorders. Any of these sorts of things, any one of them, if they're untreated, if they're not really understood, looking and use of sexual imagery could be like a treatment plan they came up with for their untreated mental health issue. People come up with all sorts of treatment plans for their mental health issues when they've never been assessed and treated. And the fourth area is relationship with drugs and alcohol. There's a whole world of people who use substances so they can enjoy the sexual imagery they feel so ashamed of looking at. They'll use a drug before they go to the sexual imagery so they feel less conflicted looking at it and they can enjoy it. And then there's some people that the substances they use decrease all of their inhibitions, and they don't really care much about their ability to set boundaries for a variety of reasons, and they'll just be starting to watch porn for all sorts of reasons. And either one of those people, if it's a big conflict for them, they're going to feel out of control. Mm-hmm. There's a whole world specifically of men who have sex with men who use crystal meth, and it's called chemsex. And there's a whole world. It started in Europe and North America and continents, Australia and in the Asian countries, where men combine sexual activity with crystal meth so that men can decrease the shame and disgust and stigma they feel for not being heterosexual while they're having sex with men. So those are 4. And then, okay, if we're going to look at all those, and maybe you're in good stead, none of those relate to you. Now we've got 3 other things to look at. If none of those matter, we still got 3 things to look at. Do you have difficulties with just regulating yourself? And there's all sorts of reasons why human beings have difficulty regulating themselves. Maybe the one you're having difficulty is with your sexual imagery. Okay. People might have other difficulties regulating themselves in other areas. We don't call every area we have a difficulty regulating ourselves an addiction. Sometimes we just have difficulties regulating ourselves, and we have to learn skills for how we regulate better. And then we also know that a lot of people who have difficulty feeling out of control in their sexual behavior are having difficulties in their attachments, the way they get close and create closeness with other people, and the way they sometimes need distance and don't know how to do that. And so sexual imagery becomes maybe a place where I get to kind of have a time to myself because I don't know how to negotiate that in my relationships. Or I'm too frightened with my partner to ask for what I want sexually because this is a scary partner I live with. So I'm going to resolve that conflict by getting that sexual turn on looking through an image rather than trying to explore that sexual activity with my partner because it's absolutely terrifying. And that's my solution. That's an attachment related issue. And then the third, a lot of people don't like what turns them on, but they like the pleasure of it.
Mm-hmm.
They are really torn about what they get excited by.
Yeah.
But boy, once they go to what they're excited by, the body takes over and it is pleasurable until usually the orgasm or something. And then it's like, oh my God. But the body knows what it likes. So any one of those and any combination, like a recipe, could be a way for a person to understand why they feel out of control. And you can look at all those areas of life without having to say you're an addict.
You should write a book about this.
Well, I did write a book for professionals, and I'm currently writing a book for people like you and Hans and Jake. With Michael Vigorito. We wrote the book on treating out of control sexual behavior, and Michael Vigorito and I are writing the book together for the popular press and the general public.
I can't wait for that, Doug. And everything you just said, I wrote down this note, that stepping a different direction from addiction enables or opens up multiple paths to look at and navigate this problem. And for me, that really resonates. I haven't even been able to put my finger on why the idea of porn addiction just as the automatic label and the automatic treatment plan for this is somewhat off-putting to me. I haven't been through that process myself, so I can't speak personally to having gone through it.
Okay, wait a minute, Hans, slow it down, because I don't know if you're giving yourself a chance to think about this. You went like with your hand, personally something, right? Just take a minute, because you don't go there often. What is there something in your body you feel when you think about, oh my God, porn addiction? What your body is wise. What is it? What is it?
I don't want to. The reaction I'm having is I don't want to downplay the people that are dealing with a very compulsive and difficult problem in their life. And
so this was, I don't want to dismiss somebody who thinks differently.
Correct. Yeah.
Even though I didn't think that way.
Correct. Yeah. My own personal breadth of experience is very limited in many aspects in life. And I acknowledge and recognize that very openly. And I don't want to tell other people what is or isn't right for them. Can
I give you a thought about that? I am so glad you don't want to intentionally convey that message.
Yeah.
But I want you to know you can't control whether you're heard that way.
That's fair.
I wish I could guarantee that somebody's not going to hear you as being dismissing them.
Sure.
I wish I could guarantee somebody's not going to feel insulted by what you just said. I can't guarantee that somebody's not going to have a strong reaction of being offended by what you just said. I can't guarantee that. But that's why I wanted to know your intention. I wanted to know about you.
Thanks.
So that's that's the best we can do.
Knowing that I can't step out from under that, what I'm feeling also is there's immense hope and possibility about looking at the multiple paths and the multiple reasons and the multiple factors that can go into this compulsive behavior. And for me, that opens the idea of really figuring out and being curious about, like we've talked about, we love the thought here on the show of being curious and asking questions and poking and dissecting, about being curious about what is the problem that goes along with compulsive use of pornography and masturbation.
Yeah. Now, the way I would say that sentence is, what are the problems that go along with your sexual behavior?
Yeah.
Because even using the word compulsive kind of conclude something
Conclude.
that may not be, somebody may not have compulsive behavior. They just may have a religious conflict.
Right. Yeah.
So I like to really keep it clear about, this is just about sexual behavior.
Yeah.
So thank you, I guess, is where I was going with that. What you talked about in the 7 points in consideration opened my eyes as to there are a lot of, really it's just, and it combines with what Jake said about there can be multiple solutions to a problem, and the word problem itself indicates a level of efforting. Like there's efforting that goes into a problem. And I like the idea of efforting towards figuring out what is it around my sexual behavior that I'm conflicted with, and how do I discover and be curious and understand and hopefully come into alignment with my sexual behavior and my desire for pleasure.
What was it like for you to say those sentences?
You could hear my voice raising as I got to "and my desire for pleasure" for sure.
I could, yeah.
It is really freeing to be able to think about the pleasure side of this and the pleasure side of sexual behavior and sex, and allowing myself and allowing others permission to move towards pleasure is really exciting for me.
I'm glad.
Makes me happy, brings me a smile.
I said a lot. Where are other people at?
I have a question
with my lecture.
I have a question that's been tickling the back of my mind for the last 20 minutes that I'd love for you to elaborate on a little bit. Am I coming through clear?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned that I think I'd like to hear you speak more to is that if you're setting the goal to stop is kind of a bad goal. If your goal is stop looking at porn, that may not be the goal that you want. Can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I had a reaction to bad goal because it's like I just don't,
I don't remember the exact wording that you used. I just,
I think it's one of the things I write about, Michael and I have written about, and we talk about, is the world of a regulating sexual behavior suffers from what we call premature evaluation. And deciding you need to stop is a premature treatment plan, right? Yep. I mean, how many of us go into the doctor and with the treatment plan, say, I've got this thing on my arm, I don't know what it is, but here's the 3 things I'm going to do for it. That's not the way we work. So I think the dilemma that you brought up, Nate, is it's saying I need to stop is a treatment plan without understanding the problem.
So I just want to make sure, because I know a lot of people have come here looking for help and the goal that they have is stop. And I don't want to take that goal away from them without giving them something to do in its place.
Okay. So then I'd have them go back and watch this video, take notes of the 7 things I talked about, and study those things for about the next month. And because, the other thing is, unless the consequences are dire, I tell the men I work with, there's no such thing as a sex emergency. They just don't exist. Nobody's died from not having sex, and nobody's, died from making a sexual error just one more time. Unless, and I'm talking about consensual behavior here. Remember, we went over that very early on in our early shows. We're not talking about non-consensual behavior. It's only consensual behavior. So I think the fear of the consequence is real. It's dire. It feels horrible. Jake's told us stories about how dreading it. It was awful. Now that's very real, but you got to take time to understand the situation, no matter how grisly frightened you are. We got to get curious and interested, and that's not easy. And you can't do it alone. It's too difficult to do alone. That's my opinion. So, can you talk to somebody? Can you, watch these programs and take notes and write journal and think to yourself, or, whatever you need to do. But this rush to solution is really an unfortunate kind of pattern that just seems it just completely merged with the idea of porn addiction. That if you have a porn addiction, you stop, and then there's nothing else that matters.
When you said the word stop, that when you have a porn addiction, you stop, I would say that's usually where the curiosity stops as well, because then you stifle, like you're saying, what's going on, and you move into all of these interventions. And I think that's why people are like, I've been doing this for 3 years or $40,000, and it's like, I'm not better. And I will have clients land in my office saying, I've done this and I've done that to help. And it will be amazing when there's opportunity to explore and become curious that there were real things that needed to be addressed and were never addressed. But when they had the opportunity to look at them, helped identify a path forward that helped them solve the problem. But it's like as unique as a fingerprint a bit. And I think that's one of the challenges with a prescriptive approach to a sexual problem is the unique fingerprint of your circumstances get missed entirely of what is causing this conflict for you, what is causing possibly inability to regulate, or what are all these things about? Let's look at that for you.
You know, you said something at the very beginning, Kristen. I feel it makes me sad when I hear people say it, when they say I'm not getting better. Mm-hmm. And that the blame, the disappointment, the reason for this whatever stopping outcome is not happening. It's all placed on the individual. I'm not getting better. Somehow I haven't followed this good enough. I'm failing somehow at this. And so I want to give the listeners a different sentence for when they say I'm not getting better. There's still something I don't understand. Mm-hmm. What if we said that instead? I'm still engaged in this behavior because there's something I still don't understand. And the behavior is the clue. Yep. Rather than an allegation. When the tumor grows, we don't tell the person they're a bad patient.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So I feel so much compassion for people who are in this dilemma with their relationship with sexual imagery. And each disappointment is about them not getting better. I just feel compassion. Yep. It's really, so that's why I wanted to go back to that, Kristen.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it because I think it is that. And I think that a lot of people can feel like they are a failure, that they are incapable, that there is something wrong. And I love your rephrasing of, there's still something I don't understand, or there's more for me to learn.
There's more for me to learn, right?
This conflict continues to present, and I haven't reconciled this conflict.
I'm in conflict.
The moral and value conflicts can take people years to reconcile. They can be really hard, especially when you value them both so much. Yeah. And it seems like your only solution is either or. That's hard.
Well, you talked about last week, the solution to these terribly difficult values conflicts is to resort to exploitation. Mm-hmm. You know, there's all sorts of plans people come up with. So the plan I'm inviting people to do today is look at those 7 things I talked about and see what you know about them, and are you interested in seeing how that works in your life? Gee, what kind of regulator am I? What do I know about regulation? You know, what do I know anything about how I create distance with the people I love? Do I know anything about how people feel closer to me? What do I do that makes them feel closer? Can I even tell them that?
Yeah. Love it. Well, we've hit our hour mark, and I feel like we just opened up. I don't know. It feels like we could talk for another 4 hours about this. So maybe there's another 4 episodes to follow, but thank you all for showing up honestly this week. And I'm really grateful to Doug, especially this week, for bringing his decades and decades of experience to helping us understand a very complex and nuanced issue and emotionally charged issue a little bit better.
Yeah.
And I think it's leaving us all feeling a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more reassured, and a little bit more confident in moving forward in a way that aligns with our values. And I think that's really exciting.
I feel like I want to say what I've heard Hans say before. I think I talk too much.
No. You talk
I
just
just
right
want
now.
to say thank you as a clinician for you to be able to share everything you've learned, seen, garnered. It's having a day like today is so refreshing and so helpful. So thank you for speaking today, because it really was so wonderful.
I feel like this episode in particular will be really valuable for clinicians moving forward.
Don't you love Zoom? I love Zoom.
All right, guys, let's end today's call. We'll talk to you next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.